I found the ashes in the morning room grate, still warm against my fingertips. It was October, 1873, and the fire had not been necessary. The afternoon sun fell through the tall windows of our Belgrave Square townhouse, in shafts of amber light, illuminating particles of dust that danced above the Persian carpet. My mother sat at her writing desk, her back perfectly straight, her lavender silk gown rustling as she dipped her pen into ink. She did not look at me. She had not looked at me properly in years, but I looked at the grate, at the curled, black remnants of what had once been cream-colored stationery, at the wax seal half melted, still bearing the impression of the Royal Academy's crest. "You're pale, Eleanor," my mother said without lifting her eyes from her correspondence. "Ring for tea." I did not ring for tea. I stood there, my hand still extended toward the fireplace, feeling the warmth of what she had taken from me dissolve against my skin. For 22 years, I had been the daughter who asked for nothing, the daughter who understood her place in the machinery of respectable society. I had sat through endless calling hours, poured tea with the proper angle of wrist, smiled at suitors who spoke only of hunting and horses while my books remained hidden beneath my pillow. I had been patient, I had been good, I had been silent, and in that silence I had written. Every evening after the household retired, I had filled pages with observations on natural philosophy, with calculations and diagrams, with questions that burned in my mind like fever. I had corresponded secretly with Professor Hartley at the Royal Academy, submitting papers under my initials, alone. For 2 years, he had encouraged me. For 2 years, he had promised that when the Academy opened its experimental program for female scholars, he would sponsor my application. The letters had come, 3 of them, over the course of a month. I had been waiting, watching the Morning Post with the desperate attention of someone awaiting a verdict on their very existence. I had never seen them. "Mother," I said, and my voice sounded distant, as though it came from someone standing behind me. "The letters from the Academy." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." She continued writing, her penmanship flawless. "You should change for dinner. Your father will expect punctuality." The room smelled of her perfume, a heavy floral scent that had permeated every corner of our home. It mixed now with the acrid smell of burned paper, creating something cloying and bitter. A clock ticked on the mantelpiece. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels loud against the cobblestones. "You burned them," I said. She set down her pen with deliberate care, aligning it precisely with the edge of the blotter. When she finally turned to face me, her expression held no guilt, no apology, no recognition of what she had done, only a mild annoyance, as if I had questioned the household accounts. "I protected you," she said, "from the consequences of your own foolishness. Did you truly believe that writing to strange men, filling your head with inappropriate subjects, could lead anywhere but to ruin? You are my daughter. You will marry Mr. Ashworth's son this spring, as has been arranged since you were 17. You will maintain the dignity of this family, and you will abandon these ridiculous notions of scholarship." She spoke as though she were discussing the weather, as though she had not just extinguished the only future I had dared to imagine. "Mr. Ashworth's son," I repeated, "who can barely read, who spends his inheritance on gambling debts and mistresses. He is a gentleman with 30,000 a year and a house in Mayfair. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I said softly. She smiled then, the expression she wore when she believed herself victorious. "Yes, Eleanor, grateful. Now change your dress. We have callers this evening." I changed my dress. I descended for dinner. I sat across from my father, who spoke of nothing but his investments and never once met my eyes. I endured Mr. Ashworth and his son, who arrived after the meal, and I listened to young Thomas Ashworth describe a horse race with the enthusiasm most men reserve for philosophy or art. I smiled. I poured brandy. I existed in the shape my mother had determined for me. But something had shifted. Something had broken free. In the weeks that followed, I became a student of observation rather than books. I watched my mother with the same attention I had once devoted to my scientific papers. I noted her routines, her correspondences, her friendships. I observed the careful architecture of her social power, built over 30 years of strategic alliance and calculated generosity. My mother was a woman who had married well and had spent every year since consolidating her position. She sat on the charitable board of 3 institutions, She hosted the most sought-after salon in Belgravia. Her opinion could make or destroy a debutante's season. She was admired, respected, feared in the particular way that women of her station commanded fear, through exclusion, through silence, through the withdrawal of approval. She had built an empire of reputation, and like all empires, it rested on foundations that could be shaken. I began in the simplest way possible. I started asking questions. "Mrs. Thornberry," I said one afternoon during calling hours, my voice carefully innocent. "You've known my mother since before her marriage, haven't you? However did she meet father? It must have been terribly romantic." Mrs. Thornberry, who loved nothing more than ancient gossip, was delighted to oblige. "Oh, my dear, it was quite the surprise to everyone. Your mother was companion to Lady Ashford at the time. Such a lovely girl, but with no prospects, of course. Her family had lost everything in some unfortunate business venture. We all assumed she would remain a companion indefinitely. And then suddenly there she was, engaged to your father. The late Mr. Carlyle was quite the catch, you understand. 20 years her senior, but established, wealthy. How fortunate for mother," I murmured, filing away the information. Companion. No prospects. A marriage of desperation, then, not love. I visited my great-aunt Philippa, who lived in Bath, and whom my mother detested for reasons she had never explained. Aunt Philippa, ancient and sharp-tongued, welcomed me with surprise and something like relief. "Finally," she said, pouring tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "Someone from that house who isn't afraid of truth. Sit, child. Tell me what you want to know." I told her everything, about the letters, about the marriage, about the cage I had been kept in. Aunt Philippa listened without interruption, her face grave. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother," she said finally, "was brilliant once. Did you know that? Before her family's collapse, she was educated privately. She read Latin and Greek. She wrote poetry that was published anonymously in several journals. And then her father's investments failed, her mother died of shame, and suddenly she was 19, with nothing but her wits and her beauty." She paused, sipping her tea. "She became what she needed to become to survive, and in becoming it, she forgot who she had been. Or perhaps she simply couldn't bear to remember." "She destroyed my letters," I said. "Yes," Aunt Philippa replied. "Because you reminded her of everything she had sacrificed. Every time she looked at you reaching for knowledge, she saw herself at 19, closing all those books for the last time. She couldn't bear it, so she tried to save you from her own grief by making you into something smaller." "I don't want to be saved," I said. "Good," my aunt said and smiled. "Then let me tell you about the charitable board your mother chairs, and about the rather interesting discrepancy in the accounts from 3 years ago." Over the next months, I became someone I had never been before. Not angry, not vengeful, but awake. I attended every social function with new eyes, no longer the dutiful daughter, but the careful observer. I smiled and poured tea and listened, truly listened, to what was said in the spaces between words, to what was revealed in hesitations and glances. I kept a journal, hidden in a hat box in my wardrobe. In it, I recorded everything. The way Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled when my mother entered a room, the forced brightness in Caroline Winter's letters from the country, the knowing looks exchanged between certain society matrons when my mother's name was mentioned. Small things, individually meaningless. Together they formed a map. I learned to ask questions that seemed innocent. "Mama, why does Mrs. Pemberton no longer serve on the hospital board? She was always so dedicated." Her answers were smooth, practiced, but contained within them the threads I needed to pull. I visited the offices of the Orphans' Charity on the pretense of volunteering. The accounts were kept in locked cabinets, but the secretary, Miss Davies, was lonely and grateful for company. Over weeks of afternoon teas and sympathetic conversation, she confided her concerns. "The numbers never quite add up," she whispered. "But Mrs. Carlyle has been so good to me, giving me this position. I fear I'm simply not clever enough with figures." "Perhaps I could help," I offered. "I'm rather good with mathematics." The discrepancies I found were careful, sophisticated. My mother had not stolen outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she had created phantom expenses, inflated costs, redirected funds through a maze of legitimate-seeming transactions. It had taken skill and intelligence to construct. It would take equal skill to unravel. I traced the payments to a moneylender in Cheapside, a Mr. Graves who specialized in discreetly settling the debts of young gentlemen. For the right price, Mr. Graves was willing to provide records. Young Thomas Ashworth, it seemed, had owed nearly £3,000 to various gambling establishments. The debts had been settled exactly 1 week before our engagement was announced. I learned that my mother had indeed diverted funds from the orphans' charity she managed, not for personal gain, but to protect her investment, her carefully arranged alliance with the Ashworth family. I learned that she had spread rumors about Miss Caroline Winters, who had dared to refuse my brother's proposal years ago, leading to Caroline's exile to the country in disgrace. The rumors were specific, damaging, impossible to disprove, and entirely fabricated. I learned that she had blackmailed Mrs. Pemberton into giving up her position on the hospital board by threatening to reveal that Mrs. Pemberton's daughter had been pregnant before her rushed marriage. My mother had attended the young Mrs. Pemberton during her confinement under the guise of friendship and had remembered the dates. Each discovery was filed away, documented, dated. I worked as if preparing a scientific paper with evidence and verification. My mother was not merely cruel. She was strategic in her cruelty, each act carefully calculated to protect her position, her power, her carefully constructed world. She had made herself indispensable to the right people and terrible to those who might threaten her. But she had also made enemies, women who smiled to her face and despised her in private, women who had suffered under her machinations and waited for someone to provide them the ammunition they needed to strike back. I began to write again, not scientific papers this time, but letters. Anonymous letters to members of the charitable board, suggesting they review certain entries in the accounts. Letters to Lady Ashford, the woman my mother had once served, asking innocent questions about their time together. Letters to Caroline Winters, offering friendship and carefully information. I corresponded with Professor Hartley, explaining what had happened. His reply came within a week, marked with outrage and determination. "The Academy's decision stands," he wrote. "Your acceptance was based on the merit of your work, not your mother's approval. Should you find a way to attend, your place awaits." Winter came, the season approached. My wedding to Thomas Ashworth was scheduled for March, and on a cold evening in February, at the St. James Charity Gala, the most important event of the season, where my mother was to be honored for her years of service, I set my plan in motion. The ballroom glittered with candlelight. Women in silk and jewels moved like colorful birds across the polished floor. My mother stood at the center of it all, accepting congratulations, her face radiant with triumph. She wore cream-colored satin and diamonds at her throat. She looked like what she was, a queen in her kingdom. I wore burgundy velvet, a color she had told me was too bold for an unmarried girl. I wore my grandmother's garnets, which she had refused to let me have, and I carried a small leather portfolio tied with black ribbon. Lord Ashworth stood to give the evening's remarks. He spoke of charity and duty and the remarkable women who dedicated themselves to helping the less fortunate. He praised my mother's tireless work. The room applauded. My mother inclined her head with perfect modesty. "However," Lord Ashworth continued, consulting his notes, "before we present this year's honor, I must address a matter that has come to our attention." The room went quiet. I watched my mother's face, saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross her expression. "Several members of the board have raised questions regarding certain expenditures," Lord Ashworth said, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing alarming, I'm sure, but in the interest of transparency, we must address them." Lady Ashford rose from her seat, moving to stand beside Lord Ashworth. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "I have known Mrs. Carlyle for many years. In fact, she once served as my companion. A brilliant girl, I always thought, so intelligent, so well-read. It was such a surprise when she gave up all her intellectual pursuits upon her marriage." The room had gone absolutely still. In London society, the past was meant to remain buried. References to reduced circumstances were considered the height of poor taste. "I mention this," Lady Ashford continued, "only because I recently received several letters asking about that time. About Mrs. Carlyle's character then, and about certain discrepancies in her accounts when she managed my household funds. Small things, barely worth mentioning, a few pounds here and there, but it did make me reconsider what I knew of her. And when I combined that recollection with these new concerns about the charitable funds, "This is outrageous," my mother said, her voice sharp. but it trembled slightly. I have dedicated years to this charity. My accounts are impeccable. Are they? Mrs. Pemberton stood now, her voice steady. Because I've recently learned something interesting about you, Mrs. Carlyle, about how you ensured my silence regarding my daughter, about how you used my family's private shame as a weapon. One by one they rose. Carolyn Winters. 3 other women my mother had wronged over the years, each one carefully contacted, each one offered proof and solidarity. The testimony was devastating not because of any single accusation, but because of the pattern it revealed. A woman who had used her position to control, to manipulate, to destroy anyone who threatened her carefully maintained facade. My father sat frozen in his seat. Thomas Ashworth had turned pale. The room buzzed with whispered conversation that built like a wave toward a breaking point. And then I stood. If I may, I said, and the room turned toward me. I have something to add. I walked to the front of the ballroom, my portfolio clutched in my hands. I passed my mother without looking at her, though I could feel her eyes boring into me. Mrs. Carlyle is my mother, I said, and until recently I believed her to be everything a mother should be. Strong, dedicated, protective. I paused, letting the words settle. But 3 months ago, I discovered that she had destroyed correspondence intended for me, letters from the Royal Academy, offering me a place in their new program for female scholars. She burned them. She burned my future because it did not align with her vision of what I should be. The whispers grew louder. Several women gasped. Even in a society that prized obedience, such an act struck at something fundamental. I don't tell you this for sympathy, I continued. I tell you this because it illuminates a pattern. My mother has spent years protecting her reputation, her position, her power. She has done so by controlling others, by manipulating social convention, by using the very rules meant to protect us as weapons against us. She diverted charitable funds to protect a business arrangement. My engagement to Mr. Thomas Ashworth, whose gambling debts she paid with money meant for orphans. Thomas stood abruptly, his face red. That's a lie, is it? I opened my portfolio, removing several pages. Because I have the accounts here, I have receipts, I have correspondence between my mother and the gambling houses where your debts were settled. I have everything. The room erupted. Lord Ashworth was calling for order. My father had his head in his hands. And my mother stood perfectly still, her face white as death, her hands clenched so tightly that her gloves strained at the seams. Eleanor, she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. Eleanor, stop this, please. I looked at her then, really looked at her. I saw what Aunt Philippa had described, a brilliant woman who had sacrificed everything to survive, who had become so twisted in her determination to protect what she had built that she couldn't recognize herself anymore. I saw the fear in her eyes, the recognition of her own ruin. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. You taught me that reputation is everything, I said softly so that only she could hear. You taught me that in our world, perception is power. You taught me that a woman must use whatever tools she has to secure her place. I was paying attention, Mother. I learned very well. Then I turned to address the room once more. The Academy has confirmed my place, should I choose to attend, and I will. I will not marry Mr. Ashworth, and I will not pretend any more that silence is the same as strength. I left the portfolio on the table, all the evidence, all the careful documentation I had gathered, and walked from the ballroom. Behind me I heard chaos. Accusations, denials, the sound of my mother's world crumbling. The cold night air struck my face as I emerged onto the street. I stood there, breathing deeply, feeling lighter than I had in months, years, my entire life. The consequences came swiftly, like a storm that had been building for weeks finally breaking. Within days, my mother was formally removed from every charitable board she had served. The vote was unanimous. Lord Ashworth himself delivered the news, his face grave, his words carefully chosen to maintain the veneer of civility even as they destroyed her position utterly. The Ashworth alliance was dissolved with equal speed. A brief, formal letter from their family solicitor. No explanation necessary. Society understood. A family cotton scandal must be quarantined, lest the infection spread. Our family became the subject of whispered scandal that followed us like a shadow. At church, at the theater, in shops, everywhere, the whispers. The matrons who had once courted my mother's favor now turned their backs when she entered a room. Invitations ceased to arrive. The carefully cultivated network she had spent decades building simply evaporated. I watched it happen with a complicated knot of emotions I could not untangle. Satisfaction? Yes, but also something harder, colder. The recognition that I had done exactly what she had done to Caroline Winters, to Mrs. Pemberton, to countless others. I had used society's weapons against her. I had destroyed through exposure, through gossip, through the systematic withdrawal of social approval. My father, humiliated beyond bearing, retreated to our country estate within a month. He sold the Belgrave Square house, quietly through intermediaries, at a significant loss. I received one letter from him, brief and formal. He made no accusations, but his disappointment seeped through every carefully neutral word. I had shamed the family. I had violated the sacred duty of daughterly obedience. In exposing my mother, I had exposed us all. I wrote back once, trying to explain. The letter was returned unopened. My mother remained in London, taking rooms in an unfashionable quarter near Bloomsbury. She no longer received callers because no one came. The women she had once commanded now avoided her as they would a contagious disease. Her salon, which had been the beating heart of intellectual and social life for our set, dissolved as if it had never existed. The transformation was terrible to witness. When I saw her by chance in Hyde Park one afternoon, she did not see me or pretended not to. She looked like someone else entirely. Her clothes, though clean, were clearly worn. Her face had grown gaunt. She walked alone, without even a lady's maid, her shoulders bent in a way I had never seen before. She aged 10 years in a matter of months. I watched it happen with an emotion that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was simply observation, the natural consequence of actions taken, of truths revealed. But it was also the recognition that I had become, in some fundamental way, exactly what she had been. A woman wielding social power as a weapon. A woman destroying another woman's carefully constructed life. At night, I dreamed of her burning my letters. In my dreams, the flames grew and grew until they consumed everything. The house, the street, all of London. I would wake gasping, unsure whether the fire had been started by her hand or mine. In April, I moved to rooms near the academy. Aunt Philippa helped secure my finances. There was money from my grandmother's estate that my mother had controlled but could not legally withhold. I began my studies. I attended lectures. I worked in laboratories. I wrote papers under my own name. I saw my mother only once more. She appeared at my lodgings on a rainy afternoon without announcement, her clothes slightly shabby, her face drawn. She stood in my small sitting room, looking at my books, my papers, my life, as though she were visiting a foreign country. "You destroyed me," she said finally. "No," I replied. "I revealed you. There's a difference." She was silent for a long time, then, "I burned those letters because I loved you, because I knew what the world does to women who reach too high." "You burned them," I said, "because seeing me reach for what you had abandoned was unbearable. But that was your pain, Mother, not mine." "You were so young," she whispered. "I didn't want you to suffer as I had suffered. So you made me suffer differently instead." She had no answer to that. She left without saying goodbye. I never saw her again. Years passed. I completed my studies. I published research that was cited by others. I attended conferences where men were forced to take me seriously. I carved out a life that was mine, smaller than I had imagined in some ways, larger in others. Not easy, but honest. Sometimes I thought about my mother, about the girl she had been, closing her books at 19, about the woman she had become, building walls of reputation to hide behind, about how fear and love can twist together until they become indistinguishable. I never regretted what I did, but I understood it better with time. She had tried to save me by making me small. I had saved myself by refusing to accept that smallness. Neither of us had been entirely right. Neither of us had been entirely wrong. But I had chosen truth over safety, knowledge over compliance, myself over the shape she had tried to force me into. And in the end, it was not her reputation I had burned. It was the version of myself she had tried to create, the future she had attempted to destroy, the silence she had demanded I maintain. I think sometimes that she must have known this would happen, that some part of her, the brilliant girl who once read Latin and wrote poetry, wanted me to fight back, wanted me to refuse, wanted me to be what she could not. Or perhaps that is only what I tell myself on the nights when the guilt rises like a tide, and I wonder if there had been another way. But the letters were ash, and from ash, sometimes, new things grow. I sit now in my own study, surrounded by books I have written and equations I have solved, and I pour tea into cups that belong to no one but myself. And I think, this is what freedom costs.